It's all right, time now to introduce you to Professor Richard Hopkins. He dreamt of being part of a Formula One team as a boy in England, and at just 16 years of age, he got a start at the Brabham Formula One team. He moved to McLaren as a mechanic, working alongside drivers like Ayrton Senna, Nigel Mansell, Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, didn't win much between the four of them, eventually driving team operations at McLaren, which is one of the oldest Formula One teams in the pit lane. In 2007, Richard moved to Red Bull, a team that had won very little to date. And his brief was pretty simple: turn Red Bull into a team of winners. He had lots of success there over 10 years, and in 2015 he moved to Sydney with his Australian wife and daughter. He is now a Professor of Practice at the University of New South Wales, and he is a high-performance advisor to the V8 Supercars team, Walkinshaw Andretti United. So to talk about creating high-performance cultures and safety leadership in motorsport, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Hopkins.
Living life in colour. Everything around me looks so beautiful and sweet.
Wow, thank you, Jess. Great intro. Whenever I do these and I hear the intro of myself, I think, God, that's pretty cool. You know, it makes you feel quite cool. I've maybe had a half-reasonable career and done something reasonably successful. Look, generally when I do these conferences, these corporate events, I talk about high-performance teams and building and creating high-performance teams, and it's very much focused on culture within teams and all the ingredients required. When I was asked to do this one with maybe a bit of an ode towards safety, I started doing a little bit of research, and it made me quite aware that maybe over the past 30 or so years involved in motorsport, even myself didn't really have that laser focus on safety. Ben, you were amazing. What an inspirational guy. Milo, I'm sort of hanging on your words thinking 7 seconds of concentration. I'm almost about to get off the stage in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What I'm going to do, and my intro sort of alluded to a little bit, is just give you a bit of brief history of myself and my career. Absolutely fascinated as a child growing up in motorsport. Quite ironic, really, considering my parents never owned a car, but maybe that was me being jealous of all my friends whose parents did own a car. But it was probably at the age of 4 or 5 when my parents gave me a Scalextric set, a slot car set. And I brought out that sort of inner engineer in me, and I started doing things and realising that I could change the performance of this little slot car. And further to that, bringing out my competitive side when I was racing against my friends. The first Grand Prix I went to was at the age of actually 9. This is a photograph of me at the British Grand Prix. I was 15 years old. British Grand Prix held in July in the summer in England. You can tell it's July in the summer by the grey sky. Little did I know that literally a matter of weeks after this, that an opportunity came my way. I was asked by the teacher to do a week's work experience, as most kids do. I had absolutely no idea what that was going to be, but it was my dad who said, why not try a Formula One team? And it was the Brabham Formula One team who gave me that opportunity. Shortly after that week of absolute joy and excitement, they actually offered me a job. So I avoided tertiary education. I wouldn't recommend that to people today, I have to say that, because NSW pay a very small proportion of my ever-increasing mortgage. I spent 5 years at Brabham. Just in case you're struggling to find me, I've helped by placing a huge grey arrow across my head. Back in the day, as you'll realise, Formula One and motorsport is a hard business. Hard to believe that I'm the same person there as I am now. Glasses, slightly portly, and a lot less hair. I spent 5 years at Brabham really learning the trade. That was my education of motorsport, spending all my time in very different departments, so the gearbox department, the carbon fibre fabrication, machine shop, a little bit of time in the drawing office. Brabham's unfortunately stopped running after me being there for 5 years. I don't think I was the cause of that. But then opened up an opportunity to go to McLaren. And as Jess mentioned, I had the opportunity to work with some absolutely fabulous racing drivers in Mika Häkkinen, David Coulthard, Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost, Nigel Mansell, and some other guy called Lewis Hamilton, apparently. It was a great time, really hard work. I realised I probably wasn't the best mechanic. I hadn't really truly found my vocation in life. I was more of an organisational person, so I crossed over into the operational side and pretty much stopped travelling. Had a bit of success with that, but it was a real challenge at McLaren, well-established team. So it was time to seek other opportunities. A very good friend of mine at the time, a guy called Adrian Newey. If anybody watches Drive to Survive or watches Formula One, everybody will know who Adrian Newey is, absolute guru in design in Formula One. He invited me over to what was a fairly newly formed Red Bull Formula One team. And as Jess said, I was given a very simple brief: make us into World Championship winners. Now, I left McLaren very military, very purposeful, very focused on the goal ahead. You could quite literally eat your dinner off the floor here. And what I arrived at was a team who partied hard. They partied so hard they didn't know what they were celebrating. Really, for me, it was to merge the two together, because we should always have fun in what we do, but we should always seek success. And success did come after me being there for 8 years, head of operations, fundamentally changing the culture and the way that Formula One teams went racing. The day I walked into Red Bull, 2 little trophies in the trophy cabinet. The day I left, 169 trophies and 50 Grand Prix wins. I'd like to think I've left a little bit of legacy behind, because they're continuing to win and doing a great job this year. Hopefully there's still a bit of my DNA in that company. During my time, not just at Red Bull, but in Formula One, and I think this is a general thing in Formula One, certainly for the teams, you operate within 3 pillars. And I know certainly when I was COO at Red Bull, everything everybody did had to fit in one of these pillars. Those pillars being performance, reliability, and safety. Now, I've kind of intentionally put them in that order, because up until recently, that was the order that motorsport, Formula One teams considered the importance of what they did daily. Performance has been around ever since the car was invented, and certainly since the second car appeared. Just like horse racing, now the automobile exists, racing existed between cars. And to make those cars go fast and to make those drivers drive those cars fast, very much the focus of attention for every motorsport team around the world. And that still continues on today. It's the primary thing we think of. Reliability. Arguably a result of pushing that performance envelope. We seek performance so highly. We push the boundaries so much. We start to take risks with that performance. And sometimes when we tip over the other side, it can be a blown engine. It can be a broken gearbox. A lot of the time, those failures result in a car being parked on the side of the track, as you see here, the driver getting out really angry, really pissed off with his team that there's been a failure. But sometimes those mistakes, those errors, have much bigger significance. Now, this looks like a 1970s movie with a bit of old-fashioned sort of computer enhancement. It's not. It's a Grand Prix that happened. It's 1972 Spanish Grand Prix with Jackie Stewart at the wheel. That is a real photograph. And that was not an uncommon occurrence. Since motorsport began in 1950, or certainly the Formula One World Championship as we know it today, the number of drivers, and not just drivers, spectators and marshals that have been killed is something astronomical. In 1955, Le Mans, very different to what we see Le Mans today, and it's a stark reality of how safety has evolved and our perception of safety and how we've moved on has changed. In the 1955 Le Mans race, it was about 6 or 7 hours into the 24 hours. There was a horrific accident. A Mercedes hit a car that was coming into the pit lane that was going much slower. That car catapulted into the crowd, the busy, packed grandstand with hundreds, if not thousands, of people in. The car cartwheeled, broke up, and burst into flames. Over 100 people died in that accident. Most of the car was made of magnesium, so the fire was just white hot and intense. This was 1955, and when I was thinking about this, maybe my own personal opinion, but I think our whole view on safety and maybe mortality was different then than it is now. This is a race in France, only 10 years after the Second World War had finished. Carrying dead people away from either the battlefield or a racetrack, maybe that situation was almost normalized. The race continued. It seems hard to believe that it did, but it did. And not only did it continue, people came back into the same grandstand to watch the race. I mean, it's just hard to believe we would do such a thing today. A car only has to park on the side of the track now and they stop the race and safety cars and everything else. And that wasn't that long ago in time. So before I continue, it just shows how things have changed. How do we stop it? This is a bit of a stupid quote, and you'll see who the quote comes from. Because we're never going to do that, right? Unfortunately, planes will crash. Accidents will happen. Are we going to stop flying? Are we going to stop crossing the road? Are we going to stop motor racing? No, we're not. But one thing we really do have to do is mitigate the risk, reduce the likelihood. Jackie Stewart was prevalent within safety in Formula One, and when he retired at the end of 1973, after his very good friend Francois Sever died in an accident, he hung up his helmet. Accidents still continued. It was a slow process, but once Jackie sort of spoke, all of a sudden there was a spotlight on it. This was a very famous incident, very famous accident back in 1976. It's the accident of Niki Lauda at the German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring, the Nordschleife, the Green Hell. A 20-kilometre track with 150 corners. And once again, we just accepted the fact that accidents would happen there. It's 150 corners. How are you supposed to get medical staff and marshals on every single corner? Well, of course, it didn't happen. But worse than that, there was not even a doctor present within the circuit at that time now. The amazing thing about this accident, of course, is that Niki survived. He didn't die. He lived to tell the tale. Not only tell the tale, only 5 weeks after the accident, he was back in a car, back in his Ferrari at the Italian Grand Prix, and then later went on to win another couple of championships in his years. Rules and regulations. Well, where are the regulators in all this? What are they doing? Well, of course, one of the challenging things about Formula One is, yes, it's a sport, but it's also a business. So we're all very conscious about the business as well. We're all very conscious about the stakeholders and all the sponsors and everybody involved. We're very protective about what we do, and we've still got that focus on performance. We don't want to drop the ball on performance. We don't want to be the first people to blink first. The FIA were very good at stating the sporting and the technical regulations, but most of those technical regulations were really about the size of the car, so people weren't cheating. But what they started doing was bringing in new regulations to at least try and slow the cars down, very much a battle between regulation and the engineers, because of course the engineers just want to make the cars go faster. The regulations were trying to make those cars go slower. So in a way, safety was being considered, but it was a very soft touch. And then probably one of the most infamous weekends in all motorsport, certainly in Formula One. People ask me, do I remember where I was? I do, because I was there and I was standing in the pit lane. I was working for McLaren at the time. Ayrton had spent a large portion of his career at McLaren, had moved to Williams. Fourth race of the season, hadn't been having a great season, it hadn't been working out quite the way he had. It wasn't just about Ayrton that weekend. It was about all the other incidents. The Rubens Barrichello crash on the Friday, and also Roland Ratzenberger, who died in qualifying on the Saturday. The race went on, the show went on, and we all went into Friday heads hung low, not realising or anticipating what was even going to happen that day. Ayrton that weekend was questioning his involvement in the sport. And they did promise that the following week they were all going to sit down and review all the safety measures in Formula One and how can we stop these things happening. Little did we know that that afternoon that Ayrton was going to lose his life. Formula One, very reactionary. Always has been. I believe maybe that's changed now. But certainly this accident and the accidents of that weekend, probably more significant than anything else, changed the approach of Formula One. And maybe, for the first time, the priorities had shifted and changed, and safety had to be paramount. We couldn't allow these things to happen again. So maybe for the first time, it was the be-all and end-all. Now, still even today, things come about and not everybody's happy. The halo was something that had been spoken about maybe for about 10 years ago, the conversation started. And really, the pushback on the halo was aesthetics. People thought it looked ugly. And would it really do what it was intended to do? The idea being that if there's big pieces of debris and drivers had been injured in the past with bouncing wheels, that it would protect the driver. But it was amazing how split everybody was over it. You were for it and against it. But hats off to the FIA. They hung fast and they introduced this as a technical regulation. And I think to this date, from its introduction only 4 or 5 years ago, there's probably at least 3 or 4 drivers who have lives have been saved as a result. We're just going to watch this little video.
3, and you see Grosjean, one car out there, and then Grosjean to the right-hand side. Just going straight.
It's torn the car in half. No wonder the fuel came out of it.
Yeah.
I said the fuel was in the middle of the car, and it's literally...
Whoa! And he's just gone straight across Daniel Kvyat there, as you can see.
That's extraordinary. Yeah.
It's just the car...
It's gone through the barrier, you see. The car's gone through the barrier, and that's then been sort of used as a wrench, as it were, to literally rip the car in half.
Wow, there's Romain Grosjean.
Unbelievable.
That's just brilliant to see Romain sat in the medical car now and talking away. There was a tyre that came off and went over the barrier as well. And there's that tyre, as I said, that had gone leaping over the barrier and has ended up somewhere in the desert.
You can see the tethers have done some work because they're absolutely shredded, but they can't be infinitely strong. The tethers holding the wheels on. Romain went with the front of the chassis underneath the barriers.
Yeah,
extraordinary.
Well, the halo saved his life.
He's gone to the hospital now for.
Every time I watch that, it just sends shivers through me, just to understand and realise that, you know, there's one half of the room that didn't agree that that was a good idea. The other half did. And I'm sure if Romain Grosjean, the driver in that accident, was on the wrong half of the room, he's certainly changed his mind now. A real highlight on how perception and how things have evolved over the years. You know, we as a human race are constantly evolving, and you know, the reason we don't live in caves anymore is because of that evolution. We've done some wrong things in the world, of course, but we've done a lot of right things in the world, and it's trying to understand what the right things are and what the right things are to pursue. And certainly in Formula One and motorsport in general, I'm happy to say that we've really shifted and we've really understood the importance of safety. You know, I remember years ago when I was a mechanic and when I was at McLaren, before the Ayrton Senna accident, before pit lane speed limiters existed, where now cars have to come down the pit lane because there's people all over in the pit lane, we're restricted to maybe 50, 60, 80 kilometers an hour. I remember being the front jack man in the early 90s, and you would have the car driving towards you at as fast as it could go. And if you were at one end of the pit lane, and the car was at the other pit lane, that car might pass within you, literally from here to that screen, at 300 kilometers an hour, practically. And we don't do that anymore. So we have come a long way, but it's not done yet. Accidents will still happen. We're not going to stop racing, although that was a stupid quote. We will continue, but we need to keep striving, keep focusing, and keep being proactive about safety. Let's not wait for the centre accidents to happen again. Let's do things that are going to prevent. And I think Formula One and motorsport in general has come to that point. So I'm going to leave that on that happy note. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that really fascinating chat. And it's always a really interesting conversation around striking that balance, isn't it, between performance and safety. And hindsight's a beautiful thing. I mean, when you've got all the information and you can look back on what's happened, you sort of think, in the instance of Formula One, why didn't we have a halo in the first place? Why weren't some of those measures put into place sooner? So if you cast it forward then, what are the lessons that we're still learning in motorsport about how we make it safer, about how we protect our people in that working environment while we're still keeping performance as one of those top pillars?
Look, I think one of the biggest things is we've now got the Grand Prix Drivers Association, so it's the drivers having a voice, and they're the ones right at the, excuse the pun, at the coalface. They're the ones who are the vulnerable people in all this, I guess. So those guys really having more interaction in what's happening. There are still accidents happening. There was a fatality only a couple of weeks ago at Spa, Formula 2 driver, and that was due to a side impact. Once again, it's going to become reactionary, but we're still, looking. But it's one of those things we don't know today what we don't know, and that's just evolution. And you're right, hindsight is a beautiful thing, but I think we've seen a bit of a paradigm shift, certainly in motorsport and maybe most industries, that we now are actively looking to prevent things, which is a total mind shift and a positive one.
So give us, I guess, an indication of how that conversation works in the motorsport industry. Who are the stakeholders? Who you want to see drivers have more of an input in that regard? I mean, to be honest, in the past, they've had a pretty silent voice, haven't they, in some of those things. So from a team dynamic point of view, just give us some insight into how that works. Who is driving the conversation? Who is the biggest stakeholder in making some of those really pivotal decisions? And how do all those mechanisms come together?
I think still it's the governing body today, and I think that's shifted. The mindset is shifted. The balance of power, if you like, has shifted from the driver, from the days of Jackie Stewart. It is now the regulator. They've got a safety board within there. The race director is in charge of safety. So they all have a very strong mind towards safety and what they can do towards it. So it's everybody is the answer. And I think that's the change, where maybe race engineers in a selfish way were just thinking about the car, not wanting their product, their focus to be shifted onto something else other than pure performance and making the car go faster. But now it's absolutely shared. It is a consideration, and it's not. The halo, I think, was a bit of a one-off. There was quite a bit of pushback to it, but I think engineers now, and like many regulations, you've got to work with it. Yes, exploit it. Yes, maximise it, but work with it. And you look at the cars today, very much different to cars of 20 years ago, so much bigger, and that is all around safety. So I don't think anybody's saying, "Oh God, do we have to do this?" I think everybody's on board. Everybody's doing it all for the right reasons. Because we want to continue racing and we want to do it safely. We don't want anybody to be hurt, to be injured from the sport we love, whether they be spectators or drivers or engineers, mechanics.
We say that, yet there has been, I guess, a cultural overhang of accepting it, hasn't there, for a very, very long time. And V8 Supercars has been another really good example of that. I only think back to a couple of years ago, Lee Holdsworth had that terrible accident in Darwin and broke his leg and was out of the series for months on end. And it was not until that had happened that it actually pushed the category to make some radical safety changes. And now they have a side intrusion box that protects the legs. And we've not had an accident like that since. Yet it was only in the last 10 years that change has come into effect. So I'm interested to know what the tipping point is around changing that cultural sense of accepting how it's always been and setting a new platform for how it has to be in the future?
Yeah, I was just thinking how I was going to answer that, and I don't know if this is the right answer, but it's a spectator sport at the end of the day as well, and you've got to understand the motivations of everybody either turning on their TV or going to a racetrack and watching the event. I certainly know my friends from years ago, they would turn on a Grand Prix thinking it was boring as whatever, but they would watch the first lap and maybe the last lap. They'd watch the first lap because they were hoping to see the accidents. Rightly or wrongly,
Yep.
you know, they didn't want to see anybody
I
die.
work in TV, so I completely
you know.
understand that. That's
But
the action, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It's the reaction. So, look, maybe that has shifted as well. Maybe the racing's better. Maybe we've all had to understand there aren't as many accidents now as there used to be. You know, we talk about accidents and reliability. You know, years ago, beginning of the 80s, you had 26 cars start the race, maybe only 5 or 6 finished. Now it's all 20 on the grid. So I think the racing's better, and I think we've just shifted in a positive way. We've all shifted across.
We've got some questions coming through on the app. Keep them coming, everyone. Other than accidents, what are some of the things that you focused on at Red Bull to prioritise safety over performance, and how did you drive those standards?
Look, I think Formula One certainly, you know, I use the example about being driven towards 180 miles an hour by a car. Look, I think it's throughout, you know, we never even used to have health and safety at Formula One. I'll tell you a story. At Brabham's. We used to, you know, this is in the old days of Bernie Ecclestone, only 100 people there, not 1,000 people there. And we had, I think they were called the Health and Safety Executive. The Health and Safety Executive, and all they did back then was ensure that you had fire extinguishers. That was it, right? That was the extent, nothing more. And I remember, this is how the story goes, that the Health and Safety Executive arrived in a taxi, a black cab, arrived at Chessington, came in, met up with Bernie Ecclestone, did a walk around, had a clipboard, ticked fire extinguisher, fire extinguisher, fire extinguisher, and then left. But he didn't leave in a black cab, he left in a brand new Mercedes. Because that was, you know, you've done your bit, don't come back, we're okay, you know, so, you know, there you go. But, you know, at Red Bull, I think we did have a focus. Once again, it's not just at the track, it was even at the factory as well, a mind shift. But I think we're all on that journey and that continual journey. So nothing specific at Red Bull, you know, I think it was just part of that culture to succeed, you know, have that single goal focus, but be mindful of everything else around you as well.
Besides regulations, how did you bring the naysayers along on the journey to improve safety with performance?
How did I bring the naysayers?
The naysayers, the people that weren't up for it, that didn't want to see the change, that were happy for it to continue the way that it was.
Look, I think what I did at Red Bull, it was all part of a bit of a package. It was a cultural change, you know, going from that sort of party attitude. I mean, that was almost quite literal, actually. Certainly didn't believe success was possible. And I suppose rolled up into that was a lack of understanding of process and how process can benefit what we do. I just had this strong belief that what I could do with these other 900 people, not the 100 people that go to the Grand Prix, but everybody else, and the power of that team and those individuals within that team was going to breed success on the track. And I suppose, you know, health, safety, process, and doing things right, following the book. You know, don't deviate off the plan. If there's the right way to do stuff, let's do that. Whatever we're doing, let's just stick to the path. The moment you deviate off that path, whether it be health and safety, machining, whether it be finance, it's going to go wrong. Let's stick to it. So we became quite regimented, not quite in the McLaren way. We still did it with a smile on our face, but very focused on the job in hand.
How is the impact on mental health considered and managed? Critical incidents can create mental illness in people directly and indirectly, and also, I guess, in those high-pressure situations where you're making split-second decisions, and it can be, you know, life or death. Yeah,
look, I think, you know, it's funny, now I work at a university and I'm surrounded by engineers, young engineers. And these young engineers are very different from the engineers that I've been around all my life, these motorsport engineers. I don't know if there's something wrong with the team of engineers I've got at the uni, but none of them drink. None of them get drunk. They're very straight-laced. I don't know. Maybe some of them are slightly on the spectrum, and if they're not on the spectrum, they're designing their own. Did I just say that? I did.
You did.
I did.
It's okay. We won't tell anyone.
Don't tell anyone. What was the question? Look, anybody who works in motorsport, anybody who works in Formula One, and I spent nearly 30 years in Formula One, chose to leave, swore never to work in motorsport ever again. That was my clean break. That didn't work out well. But a very special breed of people with high levels of resilience. I think high levels of resilience, it's funny, I was listening to a podcast on the way up here with a good friend of mine, Herbie Blash, who's been in motorsport all his life and very much talks about, you know, the resilience of people who work in Formula One and how we just learn to move on. You know, the Ayrton Senna accident, after the shock of it all, I think me and the people I worked with, we questioned what we were going to do and whether, you know, we wanted to be responsible, because all these things, performance, safety and reliability, are in our hands. It's all human driven. We can create the success, but we can be responsible for the failure as well. So, you know, I, for one, questioned. I was only 23 at that in 1994. It's 30 years ago, so you can do the maths. But I certainly questioned what I was going to do. But I think this is not a great thing about motorsport, but the pace it moves at, you just got to move on. You know, is there support? We might put our arm around somebody, but not too often. It's not too often. It's a fairly cold, cutthroat industry, you know, and yeah, it really thrives on your own individual resilience. I think because you are in that cohort as well, and there's probably support that you get that you don't realise you're getting. It's just there. It's maybe subliminal in a way.
And I think because it's the pinnacle, isn't it? That you're sort of more accepting of this is how it is, and that if you want to stay in the game and be there.
It's a bit of a show of weakness as well, I think, in some ways. Again, I'm not saying this is right or wrong by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly when you are operating at that pinnacle and the cameras are on you, I think you've just got to get up and get on with it.
Absolutely. We are running out of time, so I'm just going to skip down and try and pinpoint some of the themes that we haven't covered. Have you found, or did you find, that teams who embraced better safety standards were less competitive?
No. I think now, because it is very much hand in glove, you know, the regulations fortunately sort of govern that. I don't think, look, maybe it was done way in the past. A guy called Colin Chapman, who was the team owner and designer of Lotus back in the day, in the 60s, the Jim Clark days, the Jochen Rindt days, and the Graham Hill days. I mean, he would design a car. His thing was, why does a car need to go any further than a race? So if it falls apart after it crosses the line in first place, that's all it needs to do. So strive for cars being as lightweight as possible. But at the same time, when you look at the facts and figures of where drivers died, they driving a Lotus as well. We don't think that way, fortunately, anymore. We're not allowed to think that way, nor would we or could we. So I don't think there's any team doing a better job of safety than any other. We're governed too much by regulation. And I don't think anybody in their right mind would cut a regulation in favour of performance and put safety at risk. That's one good thing. We would have done years ago, but we don't do that. So we have come along. Still got a long way to go, but we wouldn't make those sorts of mistakes, so no.
Yeah, that culture shift has definitely happened. All right, talk shop. Best race car driver you've ever worked with, and why? What made them so exceptional? And is Daniel Ricciardo going to be alongside Max Verstappen for Red Bull next year? That's the big question everyone's asking in Formula One.
Okay, best, I've got to say Ayrton Senna, just because a completely different breed. You've got to remember Ayrton Senna was around before data and telemetry really existed, before today. So the relationship between a driver and the engineer was a different one then than it is now. They have all the data to back up their conversation. Then they didn't. Ayrton was just a freak. He could not only tell you what the car was doing, he would come in and tell you what the car needs. So if it was a front anti-roll bar change, he would know what front anti-roll bars in the car and tell the engineer that change from a number 16 to a number 18 and then go quicker. I mean, it's just incredible, just an amazing human being. I had his posters on my wall when I was a kid, and then I went on to work with him. Daniel Ricciardo, race car driver. Daniel is probably one of, if not the best racer I've ever come across. Wow. Nigel Mansell just absolutely, drove that thing, absolutely to its limit. I think Daniel has no fear and just absolutely sends it, to coin his phrase. I'd love to see him back. He's a good friend. Know his management team very well as well. I know they're working very hard for his future. I think he was a bit misguided from a management point when he left Red Bull. Should never have left Red Bull. That's proving itself now. He's back in the family. You can see he's always bloody smiling anyway, but I think his smile is genuine and there. So, hey, Sergio Perez, Checo, great guy, great driver. But move over, let Daniel in.
I think so. Daniel's just perfectly poised in the wings, isn't he, to swoop in and take that seat next year. We could talk all day, but you've got to go and we've got to move on. So thank you so much for being with us, and great to see you. Oh, sorry, I forgot we're in Europe, Formula One. I know.
I was European once.
Please give a big round of applause to Richard for joining us today. Thank you so much.